So what we're going to do is I've got a few pre-prepared questions that I'd like to ask Mark. We'll talk a bit and then we'll open it out to questions yeah, we'll go from there. So, Mark, welcome.
Hello.
This is nice.
Can you hear me?
Do I
need this? Yeah, okay.
A resounding yes.
Right.
So, am I right in thinking that John was writing from an early age?
Yes, John Lennon was writing from childhood, from infancy, really. The thing is, he was an incredible reader. He read voraciously every day of his life. From the moment he could read, which I think he learned to read from reading the Liverpool Echo, which was a broadsheet newspaper, a nightly newspaper in Liverpool, and his uncle, who was raising him, taught him to read from looking at the Echo. So, I'll stick closer. He was a book reader. He was reading Dickens and Swift and all the great writers. He very quickly went through children's literature to adult literature before he was 10, and he was reading a daily newspaper or two or three every day right through the 50s and 60s and 70s. So he was a reader, and then he became a writer. And thankfully, his work was so good that it was quite often kept by his teachers. And later on, when he was at Quarrybank, I know we're going to come to this, Quarrybank was his grammar school, which he went to from 11 to 16. He would write his own newspaper and pass it around the classroom, full of little in-jokes about teachers and things. And they would be confiscated by teachers, and because he became famous soon afterwards, these things had still been kept, and therefore they've materialized in the public domain, and we can see his early writing style. I don't know if we're looking at...
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of things just flowing through.
Yeah. Well, in fact, this one here, this is the school magazine of the Quarry. He went to Quarrybank High School. That is the school in Liverpool. And John, if you look at the bottom left here, The Tale of Hermit Fred.
Which I think, if we go to the next slide, we have a...
Yeah.
Here we go.
The wandering hermit Fred am I, with candlestick and bun. I knit spaghetti, apple pie, and crumbs. Do I have fun? I peel the bagpipes for my wife and cut all Negroes' hair, as breathing is my very life, and stop I do not dare. Well, that was 1957, the Easter issue of the school magazine. I don't think he wrote it for the school magazine, but it got picked up by a teacher and put in. That is the same year that he met Paul McCartney. He was now into rock and roll, he was now into skiffle, he had his own group. And one of the things that impressed Paul McCartney, not just John Lennon's musical ambition and his knowledge and his inventiveness, was his writing. The first time Paul McCartney went to John Lennon's house, John had a little typewriter and was writing things like this. And they wrote, you did a piece just now in his own right, The Early Owls of the Morecambe.
Yeah.
John was writing that when Paul first went to his bedroom in the house in Liverpool in Mendes.
Of course, in his own right, it's credited conjugal.
Yeah, written
Paul.
in conjugal with Paul, because they did actually, Paul helped write that. This was a hugely impressive thing for Paul McCartney, to be involved in the writing of something like this. And he had literary pretensions of his own as well. This bit, as breathing is my very life, and stop I do not dare. They loved that. I say they, Paul loved that. George Harrison came along a little while later. He loved it too. And this humour became not only John's humour, but the Beatles' humour. John's humour, in a sense, became the collective humour of the Beatles. So it was an early influence upon them, if you like. I do love the wordplay that John had.
Yeah.
And you get it all the way through, as we've just heard and seen.
So this is the Daily Howl. This is his newspaper.
This is the thing he was passing around the classroom at Quarrybank. The thing is, a lot of John's writing is schoolboy humour. A lot of what you've just been performing is schoolboy humour. The jokes that you would pass around the playground are the kind of things he liked to tell. But his facility for wordplay was extraordinary. So, I mean, he's doing all this whilst he's being a failing student at school, because he didn't want to apply himself to the rigours of the typical curriculum. He was doing this in his spare time, and of course it was tremendously entertaining for the other kids and for the teachers who confiscated them.
Yeah. So if we could just scroll through a couple of those.
Yeah.
And then...
it's hard to exactly tell his influences from it. There's less of the wordplay here. But he loved comics. So he read the Beano and the Dandy like many kids growing up in this country in the 50s, 60s, 70s. He loved Spike Milligan. He liked Ronald Searle, particularly on the drawings. Not so much these drawings, but the drawings in the book are quite like Ronald Searle's. Yeah, this is a typical piece of John's typing because he wasn't very good with equipment, John. He wasn't a technical man. So he would put things in. Some of his type letters from the 1970s, particularly when he was living with Yoko, and indeed without Yoko, typing a lot of letters, they are so characteristic of John. They're not properly set out, they're not well typed, but they are completely full of John Lennon, and that's the beauty of them. This is John's typing. The spacing is erratic, there's a lot of Xing out and all of that, but this is straight out of his head, you know, out of his head.
Very automatic writing, isn't it?
Yeah, automatic peer.
Automatic peer.
Yeah.
So it's 1964, and it's quite rare at this point for a pop artist to be viewed with anything other than slight derision from purveyors of more highbrow art forms, art, literature, poetry. So how did the book come to be published?
Well, John Lennon was writing these poems for fun. He wasn't writing them to be published. But I recently interviewed, about 10 years ago, which is in my present project, still recent, a guy called Gordon Williams, who, when the Beatles first came to do a Saturday Club session for the BBC radio in '63, he went to the studio and was there with them. And because he was a journalist writing for a magazine called Scene, which was Peter Cook's satire.
Oh, of course.
Pre-Private Eye, it's just, Private Eye's going, but Peter's not involved with this. It's an arts magazine. And John immediately said, here, I've written some poetry. He always stuffed it in his pocket. I've written some poetry. Is there any interest in publishing this? So he was obviously interested in getting it published, but mostly these were things that he just stuffed in his pockets. A guy called Bill Harry, who edited a magazine called Mersey Beat, lost a couple of hundred pieces of John's in about 1962, which John was very unhappy about, but the rate at which he was turning them out was still prolific. This is while everything else is going on as well. So in late 1963, the Beatles had an American writer called Michael Brown going around with them, who ultimately wrote a book called Love Me Do, the first really good book on the Beatles, published in '64. And Michael Brown, seeing that John wrote these poems, said, if you like, I could show these to a publisher. And he showed them to Tom Mashler at Jonathan Cape, based on Bedford Square, one of the great little publishers. In the old days, Britain and America and most countries were full of little independent publishers. Now they've all been swallowed up into these great corporate entities. But
they were the publishers of Catch-22.
Yes, that's right. They published that too. And he didn't tell Tom Mashler who had written them. He just said, does this lot interest you? Put out on the table a few interesting pieces by John. And Tom Mashler was interested. And then he said, well, actually, I can tell you they're by John Lennon of the Beatles. And Tom Mashler said, I'd like to do the book. So immediately, at Christmas '63, Tom Mashler expresses interest to John in doing a book. And while the Beatles are doing their Christmas show at Finsbury Park, on the 4th of January '64, I had to look that up, John signed the contract to do the book.
Great.
And then this is happening along with everything else, the Beatles' invasion of America, their domination of the charts and of popular culture, the making of the film. It's all happening at the same time John's doing the book.
And presumably quite a lot of the work that was in the book came prior to that. It wasn't all written specifically at that time, was it?
No, he wrote quite a few pieces. In fact, I don't know if we can see, but he was writing, the Beatles were on the road. They were incredibly busy. They were staying in hotels, and he would be writing in hotel rooms on hotel stationery. Tom Mashler, the publisher, kept hold of all of John's handwritten pieces and the drawings, of course, which are very important, and auctioned them off about 2 years ago at Sotheby's in New York. I think it was New York, for a fortune. And but that has enabled us to see the original work and just to see the scribble on hotel notepaper, which became these best-selling books.
So the book was published, and how was it received upon its publication?
Actually, one of the things I do is to go into archives, because memories can be altered with time, either on purpose or by accident, just through the retelling of stories. So I like to look at archives, and I've now seen the archives of Jonathan Cape Limited, who published not only Spaniard in the Works, not only this book, but the follow-up Spaniard in the Works, and we're hoping for another. And then they did the book of the play, which we might get to talk about. Now, the files are fantastic, and what they show is that that John Lennon's book in his own right in 1964 was turned down by 2 American publishing houses. Wow. Even though the Beatles were now huge, they were turned down because it was reckoned that this being, the Beatles being of mostly teenage interest, that this would not be a book buying market, and therefore probably we won't publish it. So it's just interesting to see this, because this was the mentality. But when the book came out, particularly in the UK, where it came out first in March '64, it was a huge seller. I think it's in your yellow leaflet.
Something like 600,000 copies.
600,000 copies, yeah. I don't think they were all on the first day.
No, but it had an immediate reprint.
It was priced at 9 and 6, which made it just a little bit more than the cost of a single. And singles were affordable to kids. That was the market. It was a lot less than buying an album. And a lot of fans bought it. Not everyone read it, because it was quite impenetrable for many of the fans, because it's obviously quite a dense work, and to some people a little bit troubling as well. So, but those who did read it, it had quite an effect.
I think that was one of the things that attracted me to the book as a younger man, was how hard I had to work, and for it to pay dividends. And once it did, and once you'd unlocked kind of a certain piece, and actually even in the preparation for doing this show, there were a couple of pieces that I realized that I'd left my entire life until I got the rights to do it, and then I was like, oh, what does that mean? And I had to figure it out, but that was great.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the book so many times. I've also been through the book, and I've tried to look at every word and see what the reference is. A lot of references to family members in there, and of course a lot of references to contemporary culture, which 50 years on are lost. It's Frisky Dyke, that was a character in Itmar from the 1940s and 50s. There's the Grand Arthur, Peckle and Braces, so that's People and Places. Big Grunty is Bill Grundy, the guy who did the Sex Pistols interview in 1976. But no one remembers these people anymore, and so inevitably there is a sense in which the meaning is being lost. But it's only when I see you do this, and I've now seen it 3 times, that you get a proper sense of actually what the construction is. Because when you're just reading it on the page, it's not easy to hear more than one voice. But the way you break it down into 2 or 3 voices per piece actually reveals the content in a way that is new to me.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think some of that is making choices about, and I'm still playing with some of the pieces, even just remounting it for this production. Nicely, Clive has suddenly come into much more focus for me. That Clive and Roger are kind of jilted lovers, and that Roger's getting married, and Clive is kind of, of course he's saying nothing, because he's kind of, and everybody knows that Roger's gay, apart from his wife. But I don't expect any of you to have kind of gone, I completely got that.
I didn't pick up on that.
But that's great. But having that in my head suddenly made it clear for me in order to kind of piece it together.
Yeah.
But it's a revealing work. It just keeps giving.
When you think that he just wrote these in, as we saw, the typed piece or some of the handwritten pieces, for him to understand the depth of what he was doing, it may not even been a conscious thing that was his meaning, but you're drawing it out in a way. If he was here, it would be interesting to know whether you've got the interpretation right as far as he's concerned.
Sure I'm at least 75% wrong most of the time. But I'm doing it with gusto, and that's all you can do, isn't it?
Yeah.
How did John feel about the books when they were published? I mean, were they things, because obviously he was having an enormous amount of success as a songwriter, his kind of star, if you like, was shining very brightly. I mean, these were kind of a very small kind of sideline almost.
Yeah, actually, it made him quite a lot of money, so that was good. But I think he was very pleased to be known for something more than just being a Beatle. One of the illustrations that we've got, and I don't know if you can bring up, it's a cover of the book, and it's got a little writing in the top left-hand corner.
Oh, yeah, that's right at the end. You might want to come out, and it's the very last. Oh, I don't know. It should be up there. It'd be the front cover 2 up there, Christine.
Yeah. But he was very, very pleased to be the author of this book, and we should talk about what it did for John as a person, in the sense that it gave him a status that he didn't really want. Yeah, this is the American cover of the book, and you'll see up in the top left corner the writing Beatle, because Americans, I hope I'm not insulting anyone who's present, but generally speaking, subtlety can be a little bit lost on Americans. And the publishers over there, Simon & Schuster, wanted to ensure that everyone got the message that this guy, John Lennon, is actually a Beatle. So it's the writing Beatle. John was horrified with this. And one of the documents in the file, Jonathan Cape, is Tom Maschler writing to Simon & Schuster saying, do not, under any circumstances, ever put that on the cover of your book again, or John is going to rip up the contract.
Oh, wow.
So it was a clear distinction for him between being a Beatle and being the writer, and he didn't want the two to be trading on one another. Nonetheless, when it came out, it did do very well. He was invited to appear and do the speech at a literary luncheon for Foyles, the book publishers. Sorry, the bookshop on Charing Cross Road. Christina Foyle, who owned or ran the shop, held these regular luncheons, usually at the Dorchester Hotel, at which the literati would gather.
I think we have a couple of pictures, actually, 28 and 29. We'll talk as it...
yeah. No, well, it depends what pictures they are.
I think they're from the launch party.
That was the one without the flash, this one. Yeah. Oh, there we go. This is actually the launch party at Jonathan Cape's office on Bedford Square. They had a little party. The man at the back on the right, I think, is Kenneth Alsop, who used to be the presenter of the Tonight programme on BBC. And Kenneth Alsop is the guy who, when John went on the show for his second book, he was on the Tonight Show for both books, said to him, why don't you put this kind of writing into your song lyrics? Because John evidently was keeping the song lyrics as one thing and the books as something else. And that idea went into John's mind, and he started to make his lyrics a little bit more that way. This is not the luncheon, but this is the private party. I think that's Kingsley Amis he's talking to on the left there. John was in a bit of a belligerent mood this night, apparently, according to Tom Maschler, and George Melly also said that as well. But nonetheless, this is a different kind of gathering to a Beatles party. Brian Epstein in the middle. That's right there. Yeah. Brian obviously engineered the deal that got this book published. But when he had to do this literary luncheon, the center point of the luncheon, once everybody's had their food, is the speech. And it would always be someone literate and often someone witty, and John Lennon had already been known as the guy who told the audience they could rattle their jewellery at the Royal Variety Show, so everyone was expecting a really funny speech. And everybody rose to toast John Lennon, and he said, thank you very much. You've got a lucky face, and sat down again. And he was back in his chair before everybody else was, and that was his speech. Wow. And there was a shock around the room as it began to filter around. He's spoken. We've missed it. Those people who were there, and they had to pay to get in, had missed his speech. And the reason was he didn't want to get up and be funny. He was a naturally funny man, but to be funny to order like that, to entertain a crowd, that was not his audience. And so he ducked it. Wow. He ducked it in an extraordinary way, and that was John Lennon. He was just his own man. He didn't want to do it, so he wouldn't do it. But in the files, the Jonathan Cape files, there are little file notes John Lennon phoned wanting to know, what is this lunch again? What is it he has to do? He's clearly troubled by it. And this is while the Beatles are making A Hard Day's Night at the Scala Theatre. There's a phone backstage. You know how theatres have a phone on the wall, pre-mobile phone, with a box, press button A and all of that. And he keeps phoning to say, tell me about this thing again. What is it I've got to be doing on Wednesday or whatever day it was? Yeah. And in the end, he just, thank you very much. And that was his speech.
Great.
Yeah.
So John Lennon, you know, a master of his own self, isn't he?
He was a one of a kind. He was a true one of a kind.
Now, was John ever planning to revisit the books? Now, there was a play. We can talk about that, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, this idea of me kind of doing it now, was it something that was ever in his mind?
Yes. In 1967, an American woman called Adrienne Kennedy she had been turned on to in his own right by her 10-year-old son, who got the book because he liked the look of the cover and because he liked the Beatles, and probably because it said the Riding Beetle in the corner.
Of course.
He got the book and loved it, and Adrienne picked up the book and read it herself, and she came up with the idea of turning it into a play. Through a long, convoluted series of events, it ended up at the National Theatre in 1968, when the National was under the tutelage, the charge of Sir Laurence Olivier. He was the creative director, I suppose. He and Kenneth Tynan were staging plays at the National, and they decided they would put on In His Own Right. It needed a lot of work. They didn't just do the book, they actually dramatized it. And Victor Spinetti, who was John's actor friend from A Hard Day's Night and Help and Magical Mystery Tour, he came in and did the main job of rewriting, and Adrienne kind of got pushed out, which is often what happens with these things. The National Theatre has its own files for this, which you told me about, which are also very interestingly revealing about the process of how this came to be. So, but John didn't like it. He didn't like it. He was interested in making a film of it. Who's that? Who am I hearing? Oh, it's down there. Okay. It's funny how the voice echoes.
Yeah, no, we're under a lovely echoey arch.
Yeah. When John and Paul went to New York in 1968 to announce Apple, he announced to the crowd he was going to be making a film of his two books.
Oh, wow.
But it never happened. I don't think it even got to a script stage, so that was the end of that, and he never mentioned it again. He did ultimately do a third book, which was published posthumously, called Skywriting by Word of Mouth, which is well worth looking out, but doesn't quite have the sharpness of In His Own Right.
No, it definitely feels to me like it needed an editor.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
easy for me to say.
some of the pieces that went to Mashler actually were critiqued within Jonathan Cape, because the pieces that were sold at auction have little handwriting on the bottom saying, I didn't find this one very funny. And certain bits were cut, but mostly it came straight out of John's head and onto the page and into the book.
I did notice on one of the typescripts that you'd sent me, there was a poem, Lob Me Jew.
Yes.
Which obviously didn't make the book either, which was a Beatles new single, Lob Me Jew, is coming out this March.
Yeah.
I thought it was hilarious when I read it the other day.
Yeah.
But, you know.
The interesting thing is, of course, I mean, it was observing your audience this afternoon, is that it's 50 years on, and what passed for humour in 1964, which was really drawing upon what had been going around school playgrounds in the 1940s and 50s, has changed. You know, we live in a world now of extreme political correctness, and to have pieces that talk about burning spastics and Jews and Negroes and all of that, it's just, it's a bit of a moment, isn't it, for 2016 to actually suddenly hear this word, and can I laugh at that? Can I, you know, most of it is instantly funny. You laugh at it before you've had the chance to intellectualize whether you should or shouldn't. But there is that challenge in 2016, since the Beatles' music hasn't really dated, but humor inevitably does, in the sense of what is and what isn't acceptable.
Yeah, I really like the awkward of the show, actually. Partly Dave opening with as Dave leapt off the bus like a burning spastic.
Yeah.
I mean, as a child, I found it incredibly funny, but now I love what it does to an audience. When we did it in Edinburgh for a month last year, you would just feel the intake of breath. Yeah. But there was something really powerful about kind of putting people in this slightly awkward zone and going, it's going to be okay. You're in good hands. We're just going to, it's okay. And you're welcome to kind of, some of it you're going to really go, haha, that's really funny. Some of it you're going to go, no, that's not. Yeah. And everybody would be tittering at completely different.
It wasn't all funny even then. No. I mean, it was a kind of humour that you either got or didn't get.
And he was pressing buttons.
He was pressing buttons, but that was who he was and what he did. And he's provoking. He was a provocative person. So the comedy that he writes, the wordplay, is thought provoking. And it's right that it should provoke thought. But is it offensive? That's the question, and I really don't think it is. He's not being offensive to spastics or to cripples, even though there's frequent references. And he used to do a kind of crippled act on stage, would you believe, that no one ever criticized, because in those days you didn't. Adrienne Kennedy is what we would now have to call an African-American woman, but she wasn't offended by the constant references to Negroes. When I interviewed Adrienne, I said, how did you feel about this book? Because did you not feel that the references to Negroes might in any way be offensive? And she said, no, not at all. And myself, I'm Jewish, but there are loads of references to Jews in the book. And although anti-Semitism appalls me and people's easy attitude with it appalls me, he's not being anti-Semitic. He's not. He's just using it as he likes minorities, if you like. He found fun in writing about minorities, but there's no viciousness about it. There's not actually hate. It's just humour.
Well, and I think he covers a huge section of all types of society through the book. So everybody could be deeply offended if they wanted. Yes. So nobody is, I think.
Yeah, with a bit of luck, everyone's really offended. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I did notice that, and I was actually really disappointed about that, because you can't edit history like that. And besides, it doesn't need to be edited because it's not offensive. It may need explaining, but it's not offensive.
So before we open it up to questions, I have one personal burning question that I want to put to you, and I don't know if there is really an answer to this, but what's always struck me as strange, if you like, is that one of the most famous men in the history of our culture wrote 2 incredible books at the height of his fame, yet I can count on 2 hands how many people I know who actually know the book exists. Yeah. I just find that slightly weird. Why?
Why? John Lennon was an extraordinarily productive individual. The Beatles were collectively productive, but also John in his own life was productive. He was turning this stuff out from infancy. He did all the Beatles things, and then when he gets together with Yoko, he does all the extraordinary output that they have of films and art pieces and everything, exhibitions. We can't be on top of it all. When a man is that productive, there are, just by nature, there's going to be things we know the most about and things we know the least about, because we can't know all of it.
Sure.
And it's just somewhere down near the bottom. They did sell in incredible numbers. They are actually, I believe, still in print. They've certainly been reprinted many times.
They were reprinted by Canongate just 2 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to buy them, they're in their original hardback form, and they're beautiful.
There are also books that combine both the 2 books, John Lennon in his own right and A Spaniard in the Works. You can get them as a little compendium.
Downstairs in the shop, I saw those, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, yeah.
So you know?
Yeah. Are you on a commission?
I should be.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things. But on a broader scale, now that John Lennon has been dead for 36 years, which is quite shocking in itself for those of us who remember the day he died, there is just inevitably a natural, just kind of, he's going into the shadows slightly, I think, because we've not had any new product from him for so long, and because life moves on. someone who died in 1980, 36 years ago. They're just beginning to recede. And I think this is happening to John. Most Beatle fans now, they talk about Paul, and John is just kind of evaporating slightly. And I think a production like this is actually a very useful thing in making sure that we don't forget and that we can enjoy how extraordinary he was. But you can't, not everything can be so well known. And if you stop the man in the street, they might know a few Beatles songs, and I'm sure they'd know more than a few, and they might know Imagine. But if you said to them, did John Lennon write a book, they would probably not know anything about it at all. So keep it up, is what I say to you, because I think it's really great that this is back in our lives again. For those of us here, and the production you did in Edinburgh last year, it meant that people went away informed about John Lennon in a way they hadn't known before.
Thank you. Thanks. Is Cassie around with a handheld microphone? She is. So Cassie's over here. There's two. So has anyone got a question? Sir, at the front. Come on, Cass. Run.
Cassie, you were fantastic, by the way.
Hi. Is this on?
It is.
My question concerns the influence that John had. John was obviously influenced, in my view, by Professor Stanley Unwin.
Yes.
I wonder how many people here in the audience know the name. Now, Unwin spoke almost identically to Lennon. Lennon refined and polished what happened, and in fact went to the next stage. But I'm not aware of any references to Unwin in recollections of John Lennon.
He did like Professor Stanley.
Did they ever meet each other?
Sorry? No, I don't believe they did. No, Professor Stanley Unwin was the master of gobbledygook. He was able to speak sentences, whole pages, that appeared to make no sense whatsoever, but somehow a meaning came across through intonation and so on.
There's some amazing Stanley Unwin on YouTube if you want to have a look at something.
Yeah. One of those great British talents that we foster in this country, just a true original. And yes, John Lennon was interested in him. When the book came out, people, the literati, the critics, thought that John was influenced by Joyce. And John had never read James Joyce. And then, being John, went and found out what he was like. Went and read him, but there was no parallel there, really. The influences were Unwin, Searle, Spike Milligan, and that coterie of immediate post-war British
and
comedians.
Lewis Carroll, of course.
And Lewis Carroll, yes. In fact, I'm so glad you said that. Lewis Carroll was... John was in love with Alice in Wonderland. He was one of those people that you hear about who reads it at least once a year, or read it at least once a year. So he knew Alice in Wonderland inside out. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is really John's Alice in Wonderland. Had he not been immersed in Alice in Wonderland, he couldn't have written that song. And there is very much a Lewis Carroll influence in this. Jabberwocky was a big part of John's growing up.
Yeah. Any more questions from our audience? Oh, sir, over this side.
I'm interested in the nonsense language, and you've mentioned Lewis Carroll now. Do you think there's any of the words in this book which will find their way into the English language permanently, as some of the nonsense words have done? What are your favourites?
Oh, gosh. That's a tough one. Well, I think after 50 years, if they haven't filtered in by now, they probably won't, because the book has lost its immediacy. I mean, it did have hundreds of thousands of purchasers, and now, of course, it's slowed to a dribble. So I think probably not, unfortunately. My own favourite, there's just so much wordplay in there that some of the sentences, they're mad, in the sense of he changes the meaning of every word or the sound of every word. I like Priceless Margarine for Princess Margaret. That's one of my favourites. And The Duck of Edding Calvert for the Duke of Edinburgh. And you have to be a certain age to even know who Eddie Calvert was, of course, but The Duck of Edding Calvert is one of my favourite names. I can't think offhand, but there are so many. What about you? Do you have a favourite?
Nothing really. well, it's the first time that I've seen all this. So I'm ashamed to say I hadn't read it before, but I think I've now got to go back and do that. You know,
Right.
Quite a skill.
Yeah, well, it's well worth a read. I mean, it's a kind of book that you can immerse yourself in because it is quite dense to read.
Yeah. There's, for me, like, I've been reading a lot of Spaniard in the works lately, and there's an amazing Sherlock Holmes parody in that. And every time that Sherlock Holmes has a brilliant brainwave, he's like, Ella Fitzgerald, my dear whopper, or Arabella Fonte, my deaf whopper. And I just always love those kind of substitutions.
I do like the fact that whenever he names somebody in the piece, every time they're named, the name is different.
Yeah.
But it's always in the vogue, so you know who he's talking about, but the name has changed. And that humour is beautiful, the way he does that. He just runs with it, something like the way Peter Cook would run with an idea. And they obviously, Peter Cook and John Lennon did know each other, they had verbal sparring dinners at Peter Cook's house in Hampstead. Wow. But they were more competitive with one another than easy with one another, unfortunately.
Just to preface, my favourite little quip when he was talking of Phil Spector, and he said, it must be for a line from one of the books, he said, that man moves in mysterious ways, his woodwork to perform. But what interests me is that he really doesn't seem to have the confidence to put that writing into his songs. It's not there in anywhere near the wordplay, maybe with the exception of I Am the Walrus, but isn't there. And post-Beatle, he dropped everything. He dropped the imagery. He was just talking plain what he felt.
Yeah, he could still, I mean, the woodwork to perform, reference to Spector, that's actually in the Whistle Test interview, I think, in 75.
It was.
So he's clearly still thinking that way. But he moved on. And that's one of the beauties of John Lennon, is that he was constantly moving on. He did the second book, Spaniard in the Works. He actually was invited by Jonathan Cake, by Tom Mashler, to do a third book, but he didn't want to do a third book because what would it be that he hadn't done in the first two? So he was moving on, and all this wordplay business that had clearly been such a big part of his life, entertaining the other guys in the back of the van when they were going to gigs and all of that, he didn't exactly drop it, but he moved on. And he always kept the lyrics separate as well, even though Kenneth Alsop did say to him, you could blend the two, and there may be, as you say, I Am the Walrus, Lucy in the Sky. Lucy in the Sky has newspaper taxes and those kind of that imagery, but generally speaking, he felt that for the lyric should express some other part of himself.
Bungalow Bill, indeed.
Bungalow Bill. Well, Bungalow Bill was a character in Rishikesh in India.
Was he?
Yeah.
Could I just ask a sort of follow-on question from that about what you think about songwriting lyrics more generally in the 60s? Because I was just thinking about what you're talking about in relation to things like David Bowie's Laughing Gnome and Syd Barrett, Corporal Keg had a wooden leg. And you get all that sort of I mean, everybody laughs at the Laughing Gnome, but clearly the people who produced it in 67 thought it was going to sell, and thought it was worth doing, as presumably David Bowie did. And that sort of, almost sort of nursery rhyme, you just don't really get it in 70s lyrics. It sort of dies out very suddenly, or seems to die out very suddenly at the end of the 60s. I just wondered what your view of that sort of change was.
I don't really have any particular insight into that. Obviously, it wasn't only John Lennon who was being influenced by the likes of Unwin and Spike Milligan and so on. And the nursery rhymes that children heard growing up they were all of the same kind of vintage, weren't they? Going to primary school in the late 1940s or into the early 50s, and then to grammar school, art school. I don't quite know why it dies out, but I mean, is it just the move into progressive rock? I'm not that certain of my ground when I speak about things like that, because I'm not so knowledgeable on it. But I think it's clear that there was a generation of English musicians who did have that kind of influence, growing up listening to novelty records on children's favourites on the radio and that kind of thing. And that was explored, and then it moved on. That's
there was a
about the
big
best I can
tradition of
say.
it, though, wasn't there, with George Martin and the work that he was doing prior to Simon. So I guess, it follows a direct line.
Yeah,
But, I agree.
I mean,
Full stop.
novelty records was a valid art form from throughout from the 1920s, really, and certainly through to the 1960s and a bit beyond, where you could do something truly left field and it would be a big hit, or potentially a big hit. But ultimately, that kind of disappeared, and there's no way now that you could make anything like that and have a hit with it.
Hi, Mark. And of course, Beatles fans got a little taste of Lennon every Christmas on the Beatles fan club flexi discs, in which on some of them he was actually in his own right style.
Yeah.
But my actual question was going to be for Jonathan, how he got into it, and because it's my introduction to your show, and just wondered how it came about.
So, as it says in the programme, a friend of mine, when I was at school, I was in a band with him, and he went on holiday with his parents, and he stole it from a cottage he was in, and he gave it to me because I was a really big Beatles fan, and it really wasn't that cool to be a big Beatles fan at that time. And I read it, and I think some of it kind of filtered in. There was a few pieces that stuck with me, and then I found it in a second-hand bookshop in Liverpool just before I went to drama school at the Liverpool Institute. And from that point, it was just with me, kind of always. I'd take it in. If we had to do an exercise in voice class, I'd read Def Ted Denutra Me. If we had to, and then as I left drama school, so at 21, I'd had this idea that it would make a great show. But as a 21-year-old boy from Leyland in Lancashire, I didn't really see how I could get Yoko Ono to. But it was way too far for me to even conceive. And then I've kind of been an actor for the last 15 years, and in between jobs, and especially when periods are slow, I'd come back to this idea, and I'd always come back to it. And I'd kind of quite sadly sit over the book and just be like, it's the best idea I ever had. Why can't it? And then a couple of years ago, I think I just realised that I had to kind of put up or shut up. And so there's a thing in Edinburgh called the Free Fringe, which is quite a new thing where audiences aren't asked to pay for tickets. You just turn up, and at the end you give a donation if you enjoy the show. And I thought that was the perfect way to approach the estate, to make it clear that I wasn't just some kind of charlatan who thought, well, people like John Lennon, I'll make a quick buck on this. It seemed a really nice forum in order to test whether this still resonated, because as much as I've always loved it, I didn't really know if anyone would get it anymore. So I raised money to put it on, and we took it up to Edinburgh, the three of us that you saw today, and it did. It was obvious actually from the very first show that this was still had a real vitality to it, and so that's kind of how I came about it, and then I'm kind of looking forward to what's going to be next with it, really.
Just talk about the front cover, which is on screen at the moment. What a striking cover this was. It's even though it says the riding beetle in the top left-hand corner, it's just an interesting young man of, what was he here, 23 years old when that photograph was taken. The photograph was taken, and the book was designed by Bob Freeman, the Beatles' great friend Robert Freeman, who is sitting here on the front row this afternoon, I'm very glad to say. And believe it or not, such an extraordinary piece of work, which almost makes no sense in English, was translated into a few languages.
Nice, wasn't it?
That is the French version.
I met
En flagrant délire.
I met the Italian translator in Edinburgh, and
really
had great success translating.
With the French policeman's cap on there, which I like that addition. You should do this one. That is the book in Russian. Can you imagine that, doing that in Russian? How on earth could that have been translated into Russian? How on earth could we ever find out whether they translated it correctly? Is there a correct way of translating such an interesting work? So this is your next.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Well, it's a comment, really. It's about the early influences on his writing. I was brought up on the Liverpool Echo. It was the Liverpool Echo was sent to us as children, week in, week out, and there was a comic strip at the back, and there was this character called Count Curly Wee.
Curly Wee, yeah.
You know Curly Wee. Well, that poem that we had earlier, The Tale of Hermit Fred, is exactly in the metre of Count Curly Wee.
Ah, okay. I know that John used to read Curly Wee.
Did he?
Which I'm sure he would have appreciated the name as well, Curly Wee. And there were annuals as well, weren't there?
There were
Curly Wee
annuals, which we were sent as children.
Yeah, yeah.
Just thought you'd be
Why
happy.
were you sent the Liverpool Echo every week?
Well, we weren't sent it every week. We were sent the albums as a Christmas present from somebody who had known my father when he was being brought up in Lancashire.
Right. So you're saying that the metre of...
The metre went.
Yes.
Count Curly Wee was in his car and driving round the town when all at once he grunted, "Tut, this motor's slowing down." And on it went. I mean, it was exactly that metre.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. That's good to know.
I'm sorry to say, guys, we've got just a couple of minutes left. One more
One
question?
more question. Oh. Gentleman on the front row.
Yes, I've got a comment on the question. The comment is, you said that you thought you got 70% of the book right. And I think you're too modest.
Oh, well,
because
thank
I was following along in the book, and you probably got about a dozen words.
Yeah,
wrong.
I skipped a line actually at one point, and I looked over at you and I was like, oh.
And
You'd be looking at me like, oh, what's he doing, joker?
But I think you brought the book to life, and I think you nailed it pretty much.
Thank
but
you.
my question is, what this book represents is the publisher's interpretation of what John wrote down on paper, and I don't know if John Lennon approved what was published in the form that it was. So my question would be, if you had to base your production on his original scribblings on notepaper, whatever, would the production be any different?
Well, I think a lot of these that we've been seeing as we've been talking are pretty much unchanged as they appear in the book, actually. There's a few with some kind of lines scribbled out, which are quite revealing, and that's been really nice. I mean, for me, in approaching the book, I wanted to do the entire book. Like, having loved the book, I didn't want to abridge it, I didn't want to chop it, I didn't want to try and use it as a vehicle to say anything other than as a kind of a window into John's kind of head. So it was important to kind of take John Lennon out of it, because you lot bring John Lennon to it, if you know what I mean. Your experience of John Lennon and who you thought he was. And so, you know, for me, it seemed to make it clearer to kind of to present the pieces on their own merits. But I think I liked the order of how things seemed to work out in terms of how they were presented in the book. I mean, so I just kind of followed it. I didn't want to tamper, and not in a way that I was trying to be too, oh, I can't, you know. I mean, like the idea of setting a couple of them to music. There was one point where I was like, wouldn't John Lennon have made these songs? But then actually it's about framing them in different ways that give context quite quickly so that everybody can jump on board, and then trying to keep the ear fresh. Because if you're not careful, it's a lot of nonsense. You could very easily kind of tune out, I think. But in answer to your question, I know I absolutely use the book as the ideal template, and I think I'd do the same with Spaniard as well, actually.